Let's talk about how to read a scholarly research article. So many of you have probably read some scholarly journal articles, either in one of your other grad courses or perhaps in some undergrad courses. And you probably know that they can be kind of a chore to read, that they're oftentimes full of technical terms. And if it's a quantitative research article, it may be full of numbers and statistics. But if you understand a little bit about how these articles are structured, so you know what to look for, it's not that hard to figure out sort of what the main focus of the study was. What is it that the researchers were trying to learn? What were their research questions and hypotheses? What were the results of the study? And what does it all mean? So even if you don't understand every word of the article, you should be able to understand enough of it that you can make sense of that article. And it means you have to understand a thing or two about how these research articles are structured. So let's talk about the different sections of a research article. And for some of these sections, I may refer you to one of the articles that I wrote, a research study that I did a couple of years ago, focusing on how journalists use Twitter as a source in their reporting, whether it contributes to source diversity. And I looked at news stories in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and USA Today that cited tweets as sources the same way that journalists might cite like comments from an interview or a news release or something like that. So there are essentially 8 sections to a research article. Some articles will label each of these sections very clearly, and some won't. Sometimes you kind of have to go hunting and figure out for yourself where one section ends and the next section begins. But you have an abstract, which is like a brief summary. And then you have the introduction followed by the literature review, which I would say is kind of like the setup, the buildup, or the foundation. And then you have the methods, results, and discussion sections, which together tell you what the actual study was, what the researchers actually did, and what they learned. And then there will be a reference list at the end. So the structure of a research article is very different from, let's say, the structure of a news article. When I teach journalism courses, I tell students that the most important information has to go at the top of the story, and then you kind of work your way down to the least important stuff at the bottom. A research article is almost structured in the opposite fashion, where if you want to know what the researchers actually did and what they found and what it all means, you're going to have to go to the back half of the article, the methods, the results, and the discussion section. So research articles oftentimes save the best for last in terms of how they are structured. So let's take a look at each of these sections in just a little bit of detail. So the first one is the abstract, and the abstract is just a very brief, usually about 100 to 200 words, synopsis of the study. What was the overall aim of the study and what were the key results? So you always want to start by reading the abstract because it tells you in, a nice, short and succinct way what the gist of the study is all about. So for example, in my study, okay, here it is. Here's the abstract. It says abstract. It's very easy to figure out that this is the abstract. Not all journals are quite as stylish about how they or how they represent the abstract. It may not necessarily say abstract in all research journals, but it's this summary that comes at the top before the actual start of the article. So there's an abstract for you. Okay, let's go back here and talk about what comes after the abstract. So the next thing will be the introduction. And the introduction section may not be labeled. It may not actually say introduction, but you know that the introduction is the first section of the article itself. So obviously, it's the introduction. It is going to introduce the issue or the problem that the study looks to address. But it's also going to tell you why we should care. So the introduction has to kind of give you the answer to the so what question. Why does this matter? Why is this a topic or an issue that is worthy of research? And an introduction will typically conclude by telling you in very clear and simple terms what the purpose of the research was. What is it that the study was trying to find out? So if I go to my article here for a second, here's my introduction section. And at the very end of the introduction section, I tell you exactly what the purpose of the study was. The present study extends this line of inquiry into Twitter and source diversity to determine whether the social media platform has had a democratizing or normalizing influence on journalistic sourcing. The study investigates how 3 leading US newspapers incorporated information from Twitter into their news coverage from 2009 to 2016. There you go. I have told you in simple terms what the purpose of this study was. Now we're going to move into the next section, which is the literature review, which is oftentimes a very long section. Sometimes it can be the longest section of all. So what does the literature review accomplish? Well, before you can do a study, you have to know what existing studies have been done about your topic. What do we already know from previous studies? And that's something that a literature review will delve into. So it will summarize and analyze previous research in order to make a case for why the current study was needed. So in my literature review, I summarized a whole bunch of previous studies that other researchers had done looking into how journalists use Twitter and social media. The literature review is also a section where you want to define and describe your key concepts or theories or topics that are relevant to the study. So in my study, I talked about whether Twitter is a democratizing or normalizing influence. So I had to explain what I mean by a democratizing or normalizing influence. The literature review is also the section where you include your research questions and/or hypotheses. Oftentimes, they will come at the very end of the literature review. Boom, 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 boom. They will be listed one by one, or sometimes they will be sprinkled into the literature review in the subsection where they fit best. So if I take a look at my article here for a second, here's my literature review, and notice I had it divided up into subsections. So for example, there is a subsection on the influence of technology on sourcing. You will see a lot of source citations here, and that's because I am citing and summarizing previous researchers' work. So this is summarizing and analyzing existing research. Okay. Here's another subsection of the literature review, and so on and so on. And if I scroll down far enough, I start to see research questions. Here was my first research question. Here was the next one. So they're kind of sprinkled throughout the literature review in the place where they fit best. Here are the rest of my research questions. Okay, and then that's going to bring us into the methods section. So let's talk about what goes in the methods section. So now we've finally gotten to the part of the research article where we actually get down to the actual study that the researchers did. So the methods section needs to explain which research method or methods were used and how the study was carried out. Did they do a survey? Did they do an experiment? Did they conduct focus group sessions or in-depth interviews? What research methods were used? And also, what were the sampling procedures? In other words, how did they decide which people to study or which items to study? How were they selected? So sampling also gets discussed in the methods section. So let me take a look at my article here for a second. So my method was, I wasn't actually studying people, I was studying newspaper stories. So my method was content analysis. A content analysis of newspaper stories was conducted to answer the research questions. And then I go on to explain how I collected my sample of news stories that cited Twitter. Okay, so after you have explained your method and your sampling procedure in the method section, what comes next? Now we finally get to say what the study actually found. What were the results? This means the answers to the research questions, or it means were the hypotheses confirmed or were they rejected? So this is the section where you give those findings. Now, if it is a quantitative study, the results section will probably have lots and lots of numbers and statistical tests, and it may have some charts and graphs. Don't get overwhelmed by that. You're not expected to understand all of the statistical tests and all of the math behind it. Focus instead on, was the hypothesis confirmed or was it rejected? Or what is the answer to the research question? You can kind of read around the numbers. So you don't necessarily have to understand all of the fine statistical details. So, for example, in my study, let me scroll down. Okay, here's the results section. And I went back through my research questions one by one and answered each one of them with the results. Okay. So sometimes, you may read something like, I'm just going to pick a sentence here. The Twitter citations were featured most prominently in 2010 and least prominently in 2009. Okay, that's all I need to know when I'm looking at this article. It's okay if I don't understand what this M equals 8.44, SD equals 5.05. It's okay if you don't understand what that means. As long as you understand what the sentence says, that's good enough. So don't let numbers like that scare you. Okay, so now you've got the results. So what comes next? Well, next comes the discussion section. And the discussion section will typically begin by briefly restating or summarizing the key findings of the research. That's often a very good part of the article to read carefully. So it gives you sometimes a nice, clear summation of what this study found. That first paragraph or two of the discussion section is something you definitely want to take a look at. And then they will go on to explain the implications of these key findings. What does it mean? What can we learn from the results? In my case, I found that Twitter was used not so much to increase source diversity, but more to quote the same old sources who have always been quoted in news stories. So what? What implications does that have for journalism? That was something I put in my discussion section. A discussion section will also discuss any limitations of the study. Maybe the researchers were only able to study a very, very, very small sample. That could be a limitation, or maybe they had a very limited time frame for their study. This is the part of the article where they will acknowledge those limitations. And then they will typically also give some suggestions for future research. What would be a good follow-up study that could build on this existing study? So the discussion section is a good section. I would spend a lot of time keying in on that section because it will tell you what all of the findings actually mean. So that's the last section of the article. But of course, there will also be a reference list at the end. And the reference list can be a good thing for you to look at because it will show you a list of a whole bunch of other articles that are also related to this topic. So I oftentimes will look at a list of references and it gives me more sources that I can check out. So one source can lead you to more sources, and those sources can lead you to still more sources. Most journals in the communication field follow APA style, but some journals use MLA or Chicago or even their own special hybrid styles. So that's the reference list, and that is the end of the research article. So if you understand all these different sections and a little bit about what goes into each section, it should make it a lot easier when you're trying to read research and trying to make sense of it.